Weakness is one of the most convenient labels arrogant people ever invented. It lets them misread restraint as fear, discipline as passivity, and silence as surrender. It saves them from asking a harder question, which is whether the person standing quietly in front of them might simply understand timing better than they do. That is what I learned in my marriage, and I learned it later than I should have. For too long, I believed patience explained itself. I thought if a man stayed calm, carried his responsibilities, and refused to make noise simply to reassure himself that he still existed, then the people closest to him would eventually understand the weight of that. That was one of my blind spots. Another was even more dangerous because it sounded noble. I believed that because I was not easily provoked, I was somehow protected from being underestimated. In truth, calm men are underestimated all the time. And once someone starts building confidence on that misunderstanding, they usually do more damage than they realize before the truth catches up. My name is Nolan Avery. I'm 48 years old, and until a little over a year ago I had been married for 17 years to a woman named Claire. We lived outside Denver in a neighborhood of stone facades, dark window trim, good schools, and the kind of broad, clean streets that make people assume the emotional lives inside those homes are as orderly as the landscaping. We had 2 children, 1 daughter in college and 1 son still in high school. I worked in regional operations for a commercial medical supplier, which meant systems, timing, vendor relationships, margin pressure, recovery planning, and all the quiet infrastructure that keeps more visible people from being surprised by consequences. I liked that kind of work because it rewarded sequence. If something broke, it broke for a reason. If a company pretended a weakness was manageable for long enough, the weakness eventually became expensive enough that pretending stopped working. There was comfort in that. Reality, however delayed, still had standards. At home, I was slower than reality. Claire worked in high-end residential design consulting. She was intelligent, polished, socially fluid, and very good at the kind of emotional styling that makes clients feel not just understood, but elevated by her attention. She knew how to walk into a room and make half the people in it feel that something had become more refined simply because she was there. When I met her, I admired that. I was more deliberate, more reserved, less interested in atmospherics. She seemed vivid in ways I wasn't trying to be. In the early years, that felt like a genuine compliment. She brought movement. I brought steadiness. She made life brighter. I made it hold. I do not want to tell this story as if the marriage were a fraud from the beginning. That would be dishonest and also much too easy on my pride. There had been love. Real love. We built a home, raised children, buried parents, survived a miscarriage between our son and daughter, and made it through one ugly recession year when my company froze raises and our daughter needed asthma treatment serious enough that every bill felt personal. There were long stretches of genuine partnership. Shared jokes. Friday takeout. Summer drives. The practical tenderness that develops when 2 adults carry enough life together that romance becomes less of a performance and more of a habit of not letting each other fall behind. That matters because betrayal hurts differently when it grows inside something that had once deserved your trust. If I am going to tell this honestly, I should also say something that doesn't flatter me. I was too proud of being dependable. Not in a loud way. I'm not that sort of man. But inwardly, yes. I took a certain private satisfaction in being the one who remembered what mattered. The mortgage. The college accounts. The insurance. The tax folders. The furnace service. The quiet transfer from checking to savings every payday. The car maintenance before a warning light forced the issue. The passwords. The calendar. The actual structure of our life. I did those things partly because I was good at them and partly because someone had to. But there is danger in being the stable one for too long. People stop seeing the labor and start relating to the result as if it were simply the weather. Claire used to call me steady. Later she called me predictable. Later than that she called me safe, and not in the way a loyal woman says it when she means cherished. In her mouth, by the end, safe had become adjacent to limited. Careful, controlled, hard to excite, hard to move. That shift did not happen all at once. Most dangerous changes never do. They arrive in jokes, sighs, comparisons, in the private tone that makes a virtue sound like a smallness. A wife does not have to shout that she has stopped respecting your nature. She only has to start speaking about it as though it belongs in quotation marks. The first real fracture in the marriage was not another man. It was hierarchy. Claire began behaving as though her emotional states carried more moral importance than mine. If she felt restless, the whole household atmosphere was expected to adapt. If I felt uneasy, I was making things heavy. If she needed space to think, that was depth. If I asked practical questions, that was rigidity. Over time, her dissatisfaction stopped functioning like one part of the marriage and started functioning like the center of it. That is a power shift many people miss because it hides under the language of emotional honesty. But honesty is not the same thing as centrality. One spouse does not get to become the official interpreter of the relationship simply because they speak about their feelings in more polished sentences. I should have recognized that earlier. I didn't because I disliked conflict that produced only heat. I always told myself that if something serious were wrong, Claire would eventually say it plainly. That assumption was not only naive. It was flattering. It let me imagine that marriage, by its nature, still rewarded mutual dignity. It does not. Marriage reveals character. It doesn't create it. There was, of course, another man. His name was Ryan. He was an architecture rep attached to one of Claire's development projects. I met him twice. Good posture. Measured voice. Too aware of his own ease. The kind of man who listens just long enough to create the impression of unusual depth in women already looking for permission to feel newly visible. Claire spoke about him in the usual defensively casual way. Ryan was impossible. Ryan had great taste. Ryan understood why so many clients ruined good spaces by trying too hard. Ryan actually listened, which is one of the more dangerous compliments married women can give when they are no longer being careful with their interior life. I noticed the name. I noticed the pattern. More dinners. More late returns. More private brightness on her face when she checked her phone and thought I wasn't watching. None of it, individually, justified an accusation. That's what made it effective. My mistake was not blindness. It was my relationship to certainty. I wanted enough evidence that my actions could not be contaminated by my own insecurity. That sounds principled. Sometimes it is. Other times it's a cleaner way of avoiding pain. I kept telling myself I was being mature, which was easier than admitting I was frightened of what would happen if I let my own pattern recognition fully speak. Claire, meanwhile, grew bolder. The first time she called me weak, she didn't use the word directly. That came later. But the shape of it was already there. We were in the kitchen after a dinner party at her friend Marissa's house, one of those expensive, overlit evenings where everyone performs success at each other until the room starts smelling faintly of competition and rosemary. Claire had spent most of the night talking to Ryan while pretending not to, and on the drive home she was almost sparkling with a brightness that didn't belong to me or our house. I asked, very calmly, whether there was something I should understand about how often Ryan seemed to enter our life lately. She laughed softly and said, "God, Nolan, not every man who can hold a conversation is a threat." That line bothered me less for its content than its structure. I had not asked whether he was a threat. I had asked whether there was something I should understand. She answered a question more flattering to her. A few weeks later, after another evening she called work, and came home smelling faintly of hotel lobby perfume and expensive mezcal. I asked why she had not answered a single message from me for 5 hours when she knew our son had been sick earlier that day. She leaned against the bedroom doorway, arms folded, and said, "You always do this. The second something feels out of your control, you turn into a worried accountant." I said, "He had a fever." She shrugged. "And you handled it." That sentence sits with me even now. Not because it was heartless in some operatic sense. Because it revealed the structure she had come to depend on. You handled it. Meaning the family continued because I made sure it did. Meaning her absence was tolerable because my steadiness had become infrastructure. Meaning she could drift and still rely on me to keep practical reality from challenging her freedom too harshly. Later that same night, when I said I didn't think marriage was supposed to feel this lopsided, She looked at me for a long time and said, "Maybe the problem is that you think your patience makes you stronger than it does." That was the first time I heard the logic clearly. She thought I was weak. Not because I shouted or broke things or begged or spiraled. The opposite. She thought my restraint was evidence that I either couldn't act or wouldn't. She had begun translating patience into incapacity. That is one of the more common mistakes selfish people make about disciplined men. They cannot imagine a person enduring discomfort strategically, so they assume endurance itself is proof of lower value. If I had been younger, I might have argued. Instead I asked, "What do you think patience is?" She said, without hesitation, "Fear dressed as composure." That answer told me more than any confession would have at that stage. It told me how thoroughly she had rebuilt the meaning of my character to justify her own drift. She needed my steadiness to look like weakness because otherwise her behavior would have to compete with a kind of strength she no longer respected enough to understand. I wish I could say that sentence changed everything immediately. It didn't. It sharpened me, but I still stayed. Partly because of the children. Partly because of history. Partly because I had not yet done the uglier work of admitting that the marriage was already being governed by a false hierarchy. Claire's appetites had become aspirational. My principles had become provincial. That is a dangerous place for any marriage to live, because once one spouse begins treating the other's discipline as evidence of smallness, betrayal becomes easier to narrate as emancipation. The actual discovery came through a detail so small it would sound ridiculous if its meaning had not been so complete. For nearly 15 years, Claire took the same tea to bed on nights she said she needed to unwind. Peppermint with 1 spoon of honey, never sugar, in the blue ceramic mug with a chipped handle she refused to throw away because our daughter had made it in middle school. It was one of those tiny domestic repetitions marriages build over time. You stop noticing them consciously, but they become part of how the house confirms itself to you. One Wednesday night, after Claire had returned late from a supposed supplier dinner, I went downstairs around midnight for water and found that mug in the sink. Only it was not peppermint. It was black coffee, and there was lipstick on the rim from an hour or two before, still visible because she'd rinsed it carelessly. That sounds minor, and by itself it was. But the instant I saw it, I knew what had happened. She had come home later than usual, energized rather than tired, made coffee instead of tea, and sat awake messaging someone when she thought the house was safely asleep. The detail mattered because it told me she was no longer even inhabiting her own habits honestly. Her rhythms in the home were becoming imitations. The next morning, I checked the shared calendar and then, for the first time in our marriage, I opened the synced tablet she still used for mood boards and vendor presentations. There were no explicit messages left visible. She had been careful enough for that. But there was an unread hotel Wi-Fi verification email from the previous weekend, tied to a boutique property downtown where no supplier dinner had ever needed to happen. Then came the invoices, the parking receipts, the reservation trail, one private dinner at a place Ryan had once recommended to me as the only restaurant in this town that respects quiet. The cruelty of that detail almost impressed me. I did not confront her then. That is where the title truly begins to mean what it means. Because a man who is genuinely weak reacts for relief. A man who is patient endures for structure. I did not stay quiet because I feared losing her. I stayed quiet because I finally understood I was already dealing with someone who had rebuilt the moral language of the marriage around her own appetite. Early confrontation would only have given her what she still thought belonged to her: control over timing, tone, and the scope of truth. So I watched. I documented. Statements, transfers, dates, reimbursements, hotel charges. One private membership fee for a co-working club Ryan used that had somehow ended up on our card. I met with an attorney. Her name was Elaine Sutter. Late 60s, exact, unimpressed by emotional glamour. I told her about the affair, the children, the finances, the threat hidden inside the way Claire now described my character. Elaine listened and then said, "People who call patience weakness are usually relying on it to protect them." That was exactly right. Claire had built her confidence not on her own courage, but on my restraint. She believed the house would remain orderly, the children would remain shielded, the bills would remain handled, The father would remain present, and the husband, if he spoke at all, would do so carefully enough that she could still redirect the narrative. In other words, she had mistaken my character for her shelter. Once I understood that, the rest became clear. I no longer needed to prove that she was lying. I needed to stop helping the lie function. I changed slowly, which unsettled her more than anger would have. I stopped asking where she'd been, stopped waiting to eat, stopped smoothing the emotional atmosphere after her little disappearances into private brightness. I remained fatherly, responsible, civil. I paid the tuition, scheduled the HVAC service, took our son to practice. I kept the house real for the children. But I withdrew my old emotional labor from her completely. The warm patience she had mistaken for weakness was replaced by something she had not expected from me: calm indifference to the games that once moved me. One night she said, "You've gotten really cold." I said, "No. I've just stopped doing the work that let you misunderstand me." She stared at me, and for the first time I saw uncertainty where arrogance had lived. Not guilt. Not yet. Just the first hint that the old story might not hold. The turning point came on a Friday evening when she tried, one last time, to use my supposed weakness against me. She came home from what she called a project dinner, set her bag on the table, and found the kitchen dim, the dishwasher running, and the folder I had prepared lying on the island. "What's this?" she asked. The part where we stopped pretending patience and helplessness were ever the same thing. Inside the folder were the hotel records, statements, transfers, apartment research she had begun quietly doing, and the separation petition already drafted. Not theatrically arranged. Just accurate. She looked through it quickly at first, then more slowly. Her face changed in stages. Irritation, recognition, calculation, then something closer to fear. Not fear of me. Fear of consequence. Then she said the line that told me everything. "You've been acting weak this whole time." No. I had been acting patient. There is a difference selfish people only understand after they've exhausted what they think is their leverage. I said, "No. I was patient long enough to see the whole structure." That was when the truth was revealed. Not that there had been another man. I already knew that. The deeper truth was that Claire's entire confidence rested on a childish reading of strength. She thought whoever moves first, speaks louder, threatens more effectively, or controls access to affection must be the stronger spouse. She thought order meant dependence. She thought my willingness to preserve dignity for the children meant I lacked the will to act decisively for myself. In short, she had built her whole private life on the assumption that my calm meant consent. She was wrong. The divorce that followed was not exciting. That is one of the reasons real endings are more painful than dramatic stories suggest. They are quiet, expensive administrative things. Accounts, schedules, housing, tuition, disclosure. The long dull labor of separating what two adults had once fused through hope, children, and years. Ryan vanished quickly once the affair lost the flattering contrast of secrecy and started requiring ordinary loyalty. That did not surprise me. Men like him often matter less than betrayed spouses imagine. They are usually not the center. They are a mirror held up to somebody else's vanity. What stayed with me was not him. It was Claire's misunderstanding. Months later, after mediation and after the decree, she said to me outside our son's graduation dinner, "I really thought you'd fall apart." I looked at her and said, "That was your mistake." There was no point elaborating. By then, the evidence had already done the speaking. The children were steady. The house had been sold properly. The accounts were clean. I was not radiant, not triumphant, not better off in the cheap way people say when they need neat endings. I was sad, tired, but intact. More intact, I think, than she had ever believed possible. Because what she had mistaken for weakness was never that at all. Patience is a dangerous quality when practiced by fools. It becomes self-erasure. But patience practiced by a man who still knows who he is becomes something else. It becomes a refusal to let another person's chaos decide your timing. It becomes the discipline to wait until the truth is no longer arguable. It becomes the choice not to confuse reaction with strength. And if there is any message worth keeping from what happened to me, it is this. Many people who call you weak are simply uncomfortable with the fact that you are not performing your strength in a form they understand. They need power to be visible, emotional, immediate. They need it to look like appetite because that flatters the way they live. But real strength is often quieter than that. It looks like structure. It looks like sequence. It looks like refusing to hand your dignity to someone merely because they are louder about their desires. Claire thought I was weak because she only understood force. I was patient because I understood consequence. That difference did not need a speech. It only needed time.